Hello and welcome to Season 6, Episode 1 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. And I just want to wish a very warm welcome back to everyone, our regular viewers, and a welcome to any new viewers who might have joined us, and wish you all a very, very happy new year. As I said, I can't believe we're now on our 6th season. So thank you to all our viewers for joining us, whether this is your first episode or your 101st episode. We are very grateful to have you along for the ride. Speaking of episodes, we have over 160 recorded and available on YouTube. So if you've missed out on any episodes, you can always catch up on our YouTube channel. Please do like and subscribe to receive updates when we post. And of course, we are on all major social media channels, and you can use the hashtag Conservation Conversations to let us know what you think of the show. Oh, apologies. So we do aim to keep these webinars free for all to learn and enjoy. So if you do enjoy the webinars and can contribute, no matter how small an amount, please do consider donating. You can donate through the BirdLife South Africa webpage at the link on the screen, or you can scan the QR code. Otherwise, you can EFT BirdLife South Africa directly and use the reference webinars and your name. And we also wanted to highlight an MSc project being done by Lance Robinson, who is looking at is researching AV tourism and community bird guides in conservation. So if you haven't yet taken the survey, please do. It would mean a great deal to him to have more responses in the survey and would help his master's work immensely. So please do scan the QR code or go to the link on the screen now. So this evening, we are very pleased to be back on your screens with a webinar about the bird of the year. And for this year, that is the red-billed oxpecker. And we have Dr. Leigh Combrink joining us as our presenter tonight. She is an assistant professor in wildlife disease and conservation at the University of Arizona. But she grew up in Cape Town and studied at the University of Cape Town, where she obtained a master's in conservation biology from the Fitzpatrick Institute. And she completed her PhD on the ecology of the southern ground hornbill at the University of KwaZulu-Natal while running the Operation Oxpecker project, working for the Endangered Wildlife Trust. Leigh's current research focuses on wildlife health in our changing climate, including projects looking at parasites and microbiomes of species such as Ugandan mountain gorillas, African vultures, northern bobwhite, and wood ducks, as well as understanding how the risk of West Nile virus will shift for both birds and humans by modeling the response of mosquito populations to climate change in Arizona. So I think there's plenty there that we could invite Leigh back for another Conservation Conversations, but tonight she will be talking about the red-billed oxpeckers. So Leigh, you're welcome to switch on and start sharing your presentation.
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction. So today what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to cover the ecology of the red-billed oxpecker, and then I will discuss a little bit about the population status, and then I'm going to walk you through the reintroduction process that was part of the Operation Oxpecker program. Technical difficulties. So oxpeckers are part of the Buffagidae family, or the starlings and miners sternidae, depending on who you speak to. There are 2 species in this family, and we have the yellow-billed oxpecker, which is Buffagus africanus on the left, and the red-billed oxpecker, the Buffagus erythrorhynchus, on the right-hand side. And both of these species, they occur in Africa only. But what you can see if you look at the differences is that the yellow-billed has got a much thicker bill and it's two-toned, whereas the red-billed, it's a completely red, sort of thinner bill. And the red-billed oxpeckers have this distinctive yellow eye wattle, and they also have a dark rump compared to the lighter rump of the yellow-billed oxpecker. So just a little bit about oxpecker ecology. They are cooperative breeders, so they usually breed in small groups of 2 to 6 birds. And the breeding season in South Africa runs from sort of September, October, right the way through to February, March. They are what we call a secondary cavity nester. So that means that they have to find the suitable cavities in their environment, and they cannot sort of carve out a nest site for themselves. But we usually find them nesting in holes in trees. But they also like to nest in fence posts. This is Ronelle Visagie from the Endangered Wildlife Trust having a look in a fence post to see if she could find any breeding oxpeckers. And this is actually a really good thing because it's helped with their recovery and that they take to nest boxes really, really well. So during the breeding season, oxpeckers can lay 2 to 3 eggs on average per clutch. And if it's a really good bumper year, they can lay up to 5 eggs per clutch, and they can sometimes lay 3 clutches per season. So if you get them in an area and it's a good year, you can increase your number of oxpeckers quite significantly. And that's just a picture of what the eggs actually look like in the nest. So mainly what they feed on is ticks, horseflies, and other ectoparasitic invertebrates. And in this way, they provide a very useful ecosystem service because they can help to control the spread of disease for both cattle and wildlife. And I put this picture in there with the impala to show you that scissor-like bill action that they do when they're feeding, and that allows them to pick up all the little nymph ticks and all the ectoparasites while they are feeding. And interestingly, in captivity, there was a single red-billed oxpecker where they looked at how much it was able to consume, and they found the equivalent of 7,195 engorged Amblyoma hebrum nymphs, and that's the South African bont tick nymphs in the stomach of this individual, and that was a paper by Besadenhout and Stutterheim in 1980. They also are known to feed on wounds and wound tissue, and they are known to keep wounds open. So this is a problem in that it can mean that the wound takes a longer time to heal, even though their feeding on it often does clean it out and prevent further infection. So this is one aspect that can cause conflict with landowners, especially landowners with stud animals, where they do not want to have animals walking around with big open wounds on them. But it's suspected that they do this in a way of like sort of supplementing their diet in the winter when tick abundance is thought to be much lower. They also like to supplement their diet with other tasty morsels like earwax and mucus and dry skin flakes of their hosts. And I just love this picture showing oxpeckers going in and out of all the cavities of this buffalo. If we have a look at the host species, you can see that they do range quite considerably, everything from giraffe, kudu, sable, hippo, nyala, impala, buffalo, eland, zebra, and rhino. And then, of course, we do know that they like to sit on cattle and even, as this picture shows, horses. So when we want to look at the global range, as I mentioned before, they are found in Africa, and according to the IUCN Red List, they are currently listed as globally as least concern, owing to the number of populations that are spread across the continent. And their distribution, they prefer savannas, bushvelds, and sort of grassland habitat. So this would be sort of ideal oxpecker country that we're looking at here. And this distribution is very much following the distribution of their favorite tick species. So this is from Stutterheim in the 1980s, and this is just showing you in the map here of South Africa. You can see the hashed area is showing you the distribution of what used to be Bufus, but is now Rhizocephalus decoloratus. This is the South African blue tick. That's the distribution of the blue tick there in the hashed area. And then those sort of right angle triangles are showing you the distribution that was known for red-billed oxpeckers prior to 1970. And one of the other species that they really liked was the brown ear tick. So you can see how closely the distribution pre-1970 sort of matches that hash distribution of the brown ear tick, which is Rhizocephalus appendiculatus. So another study by Besadenhout and Stutterheim in 1980, they looked at 53 stomachs of red-billed oxpeckers from the Kruger National Park, and they analyzed them to see what species of ticks the birds preferred. And these were the predominant species that they found, the brown ear tick and the South African blue tick. So it's important when you're wanting to think about putting birds into an area that you make sure that these two species are present. Interestingly, they found between 16 and 1,665 ticks per stomach. And that's just highlighting the impact that these birds really can have as an ecosystem service and tick removal service for cattle and wildlife. And one of the other ways that they tested was that they actually did a feeding trial where they gave a whole different selection of ticks to oxpeckers to see which in captivity to see which ones they preferred, and these two species were the ones that they definitely chose above all others. So I've included here the current distribution within South Africa from the South African Bird Atlas Project, the SABAP2. And you can see here how the distribution is very much hugging those areas that are sort of more bushveld savanna. But you can notice that there are some areas down in the Eastern Cape and around Kimberley and in KwaZulu-Natal as well. And this just, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but the darker areas are indicating higher reporting rates here. So it's very nice that currently the national conservation status for red-billed oxpeckers in South Africa is least concern, but this was not always the case. So actually, they started suffering a population decline early in the 20th century. And one of the main culprits of this was a decline in host species for a number of different reasons. Firstly, there was a huge rinderpest epidemic from 1891 to 1897. And you can see this is a photograph here showing you the cattle that was lost during a rinderpest outbreak in South Africa in 1896. And one report stated that there was a loss of more than around 5.2 million cattle south of the Zambezi during this rinderpest outbreak. And they also lost a number of wild populations of buffalo, giraffe, and wildebeest. So coupled with this, during the early 1900s, there was kind of an sort of overexploitation, but really like an interest in hunting wild game, especially for sport. And so that led to, again, a loss of some of the important hunting species, host species for the red-billed oxpeckers. And if you add to this that there was a lot of industrialization, so it's suspected that with industrialization and land use change, there was a loss of these potential nesting trees, so that could have compounded this whole crisis. And on top of that, if you're having a land use change, you're probably losing suitable wildlife areas as well. And then, of course, we have agricultural transformation. So this was where a lot of people were switching from wild game, and they were replacing this with livestock. And then particularly, the problems that arose with that is that these would require dipping to remove ticks and other ectoparasites. And especially from the 1940s, there was kind of an intensive cattle dipping, and many of the compounds that were used contained arsenic. And so this was a problem for that in that it killed the ticks really, really well, but it also killed the birds, and it also reduced tick numbers in certain areas where there was not enough to sustain the bird populations in those regions. And so this is just pulling a map. It's kind of an old one, but it's the old SABAP1 map showing the distribution at the time of red-billed oxpeckers. And you can see here that they really are concentrated in these dark blue areas, and that's kind of right along the border, and then sitting here in the Kruger National Park, and a couple of tiny spots maybe in KwaZulu-Natal. So what this meant is with all of these different factors, with the dipping of the cattle and the loss of the wildlife and the changing of land use, the birds were stuck in these sort of protected areas and only really found there, and not really found so much outside of protected areas. And so they were kind of stuck in these little refugia in a way. So within these areas, they did well, but as soon as they left, they didn't survive. So luckily, in the 1980s, they started changing the compounds that they used for acaricides, so tick pesticides. And what they changed them to were these pyrethroids. And pyrethroids are not lethal to oxpeckers, even if they eat ticks that have been treated with them. And so this kind of opened the door for the possibility of being able to do red-billed oxpecker reintroductions outside of protected areas. And so in 1988, the red-billed oxpecker reintroduction program was initiated by the South African National Parks. And it ran very, very successfully for 10 years. And how this project worked was it would wait for requests from private landowners who either had cattle or game, but they were wanting to find a solution for their tick issues where they didn't have to use dips to control these, and especially with wild animals, they didn't want to be dipping wild animals. So this worked really well and ran for 10 years, but then unfortunately it ran out of funding. But luckily in 2002, the Endangered Wildlife Trust took over and they initiated the Operation Oxpecker project. So this was originally run by Gerard Verdweren, and then it was taken over by Eugene Marrer, and then following that was run by Arno Leroux, and then by me. So I joined the EWT in 2009, so the project had already been going for 7 years, and I officially took over the Operation Oxpecker project in 2012. Okay. So the overarching aims of the Operation Oxpecker project were that we wanted to continue to capture and relocate birds, but we also wanted to be able to accurately assess potential new sites for reintroduction. And then we wanted to know, like, how successful have the previous reintroductions actually been? And then, of course, we wanted to make sure we were conducting relevant research to make sure that we have the best management plans in place for the species. So this is just showing you a flow diagram of everything that is actually involved in an operation, in an oxpecker reintroduction. So the first and foremost thing would be a desktop assessment. So that would be where we would actually just take all of our information and data and look at the historical ranges and decide whether or not this was a site that we even thought could be possible to put oxpeckers in or not. And many of the sites would actually be a no straight away, and we would have to try and chat with the landowners to come up with alternatives for them controlling their ticks without using oxpeckers. But I've highlighted those first three, the initial site visit and the landowner engagement, because sometimes those can occur almost together depending on the area. So as I said, we started out, the first key thing is identifying the suitable sites for relocation. So we would do the desktop exercise, and if that looked like it was a good site, we would go out to the site and actually drive around and have a look and see if we could see sufficient tree species, and we could see that there were enough host species, and actually try and get an indication of what the tick situation was in the area. And this was quite labor intensive because it would involve a lot of landowner engagement. As you can imagine, if you're going to put oxpeckers onto one site, they have wings, and so will not necessarily just stay in that specific area. They're going to fly to all the neighbors as well. So it's great to have that one champion landowner who's really interested and keen to have birds. But if the neighbors aren't on board and they're not going to be happy, it's going to be a failed reintroduction attempt. So a lot of this work would involve giving presentations in English and Afrikaans and making sure that everyone understood what we required if we were going to bring birds out. This was also kind of difficult because sometimes we would go to a site where we would realize when we were there that this probably wasn't going to be a successful site. And then we would have to go back to the drawing board and have a think about why the desktop exercise thought it was a good site. And so what we realized was that we probably needed some updated information, and a lot of the maps and data that we had specifically on tick distributions was quite outdated. So looking at historical distributions and tick distributions from the 1980s and 2014 is not necessarily a good idea for deciding where oxpeckers should be reintroduced. And so that was an exciting era. We were able to bring a postdoc, Ridika Kale, in. She worked at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and she worked on looking at finding suitable habitats for the reintroduction of red-billed oxpeckers. We were able to collaborate with some of the leading tick researchers in the country, and they shared some of their unpublished data with us on sort of more up-to-date distributions for those 2 tick species. So this is showing you the South African blue tick distributions, and this was based on habitat suitability models. And you can see the colors there going from gray to red. So red was very, very suitable, and gray being not suitable. So you can see again how those areas hugging the coast look really suitable up into the areas in the south of Kruger National Park. So reds and oranges would have been the sites that we would have looked for reintroduction sites. And then again, same here for the brown ear tick. You can see how a lot more red and orange along the coast, and then sort of up into the like Kruger National Park area as well. So what Relocation ended up doing was we took all the data we could possibly get our hands on. So we had the known and reported red-billed oxpecker sightings data from the South African Bird Atlas Project. We looked at historical red-billed oxpecker distribution data. We also included those updated tick distribution models for those 2 specific tick species. And then we looked at wildlife, cattle, and host distribution data. So anything we thought could be a suitable host, we actually wanted to see where are they now actually in the country as opposed to where they were in the past. Then we added in the known reintroduction sites. And then another important factor was the weather. So we know that red-billed oxpeckers can't handle a large number of nights if the temperatures drop below freezing. So we had to make sure to exclude those areas because those are known sites where they wouldn't naturally occur. And then the last thing we looked at was the current vegetation and the land cover data. So we put all of that together into the niche model, and what we were able to find was we looked at a number of different models, and one of the best fit was the ensemble model, so combining a lot of them together. And interestingly, the factors that we found most important that led to this model being the best fit, so for red-billed oxpeckers, a site that's considered good, it must have moderate to high tree cover and woodland habitat available. We found that starling density was really important, and we used that as a proxy for cavity nesting birds, almost like trying to see the availability of nesting sites in an area and how important that was. So those 2 were the most important. And then it was followed by the host and tick density, and then the bioclimate, as well as surface water body density, and then proximity to protected areas was the last. So those are the kinds of things that we found were most important in deciding if the site was a good site or not for oxpecker introduction. Okay, so the next step in our flow chart here says follow-up site visit. So if funding allowed, we did actually go back to the sites after we'd had our initial engagement with the farmers, and this allowed us to check that all the landowners actually were on board. Sometimes we would have to do this via email or phone call, but we did have agreements that we'd have to get in place that the farmer would commit to certain things. And so the key factors that we had for this were that they had to agree to using only pyrethroid-based oxpecker-friendly compounds in the area, that they had to erect nest boxes at suggested sites all over their property so that we would make sure that there would be sufficient nesting sites for the birds that we introduced into the area. And then one very key factor was that they had to ensure that there was an appropriate enclosure for the soft release and that it would be available when we brought the birds there. So when we would take the birds to a site, and this didn't have to be a fancy aviary or anything, although some people went all out making beautiful structures, we just tried to get like an outbuilding or something that could be sealed off here. You can see this is one in KwaZulu-Natal High Flats area where they built an external double door system with the shade cloth, and that was just to make sure that there weren't any gaps where the birds could sneak out, because they will. And then we would also make sure that the landowners had proper heating and they knew what food was required, and that they were prepared properly. So once all of that was in place, then the fun began, because then we could actually start with our oxpecker captures. So this is also a multi-step process. The first thing would be to find a suitable capture site. So as much as some farmers were desperate to have oxpeckers, we had other farmers who had plentiful numbers, as you can see here, and they were only too happy for us to come and catch and remove up to 50 oxpeckers from their property at a time. And just to show you, we would try this. This was on a cattle farm. And they were clearly, the birds were sitting on the cattle a lot. And so this farmer was upset that they were causing a lot of wounds, especially to the young animals, because of course their skin is a lot softer. And so it's easier to create wounds or to keep wounds open. And then I've got a picture here just showing you what all of that involved. So we would have to set up nets all around these cattle kraals, which had its own challenges because they were just barbed wire everywhere, and then the wind would blow and the cattle would turn its head and get its horn stuck in the net. We had the cattle trying to eat the net, so it was a big learning experience, but it was a lot of fun, and we were quite successful. So we captured oxpeckers on this farm for reintroduction quite a lot, but we were very lucky to be able to work in the Kruger National Park. And they have dedicated wildlife bomas in Skakuza. So we would set up our nets, as you can see there on the left-hand side. That's one of the rhino bomas there. And so we would set our nets up all the way around. But as you can see, when the wind blows like that, it's totally obvious to the birds where the nets are, and they would just fly along and up and over and land on the rhino anyway. So we had limited success at this time here. We also had the problem in that there were a number of different bomas, and we would set all our nets up around one of the rhinos, but if there were rhinos in a different boma further back, then all the oxpeckers would sit there because they would know something was up with you putting nets around this one. So smart birds in some ways. The nice thing about this is that because the Sandbox had run the Oxpecker project before, they had a dedicated aviary, which was just behind these rhino bomas there, the Skakuza wildlife bomas. And so it was really nice and quick for us to be able to catch the birds and drop them straight off at the aviary and then come back. One fun thing that happened, though, was I suppose with the rhino poaching that happened, there was a company that made these fiberglass rhinos. And so they decided to donate them to Sandbox to put at all of the entrance gates as kind of a symbol of anti-rhino poaching and like support for rhino conservation. But they made an excess of these, and so some of them were stored in a warehouse. And so we got permission to put one of these out near one of the rhino bomas just to see what happens. And you can see it's still got the packing tape on its feet there. But it worked really, really well. I would not have thought this, but the birds landed on it, and I expected them to land and be like, this is fiberglass, and fly off, but they didn't. They were looking in all the crevices, and we thought, this is gold. This is going to help us be able to catch birds very quickly. And so that's what we started doing. And so this is what my project vehicle would look like driving around the Kruger National Park with a fiberglass rhino on a trailer. And this picture like this actually ended up on Facebook with someone making the comment about they're really happy with Kruger's new rhino reintroduction program or something. It was really funny. But being able to have this really lightweight rhino that two people could carry made it possible to put the rhino out at different sites. So here we just put it at a waterhole, and then we just put nets right around the rhino, really close to the ground as well. So any sort of angle that the birds wanted to land, we were able to catch them. And we were very successful here at being able to catch the entire group. So that's something else that has been a problem in the past, is if you catch two individuals, you're not sure which two of a group you're catching. But here we would get like 5 individuals flying around, and we would be able to catch all of them in one go. Another interesting decoy option was employed by Moreno Jordan. She was a master's student at UKZN. So she was working in KwaZulu-Natal, specifically looking at the success of the reintroductions that occurred there. And of course, we couldn't take the fiberglass rhino on the trailer all the way down to KZN. So she improvised this zebra skin on a barrel, and this also worked really well. So as much as I thought the birds were super smart, they clearly just hone in on a site from far and think that's the place to be. So this was very successful as well. And so then once we've actually got the birds in the net, that's when some of the fun actually begins. So there's a whole lot of things that are involved in this as well. You need to get your permits for capture and relocation. You need to make sure that your aviary is ready. So that involves heating and food sources and electrolytes for the birds, and then also having all your ringing equipment and people. So it's quite an endeavor to get this off the ground. And I just put this in here to show that one of the things I really like doing was being able to train other people as well. And As you can see, I didn't let motherhood stand in the way of research and training the even younger generations, but it was really fun time. So once we had the bird in hand and we'd taken it out of the net, we would fit them both with the numbered metal saffring and then coloring. So we had different colorings, specifically a different color for each of the reintroduction sites that I was involved in. And that was specifically to be able to tell if we saw a bird that had a color where it came from in case one moved, because they have been known to fly fairly long distances. But then also to be able to see if we find birds that don't have rings, then we know that they are the offspring of the birds that were reintroduced in the area. Another important thing is that both male and female oxpeckers look the same. So we need to take a little blood sample. So we would just prick them and take a blood drop, and then we would send that away for sexing, because we don't really want to catch 50 birds that are all males and then reintroduce them and hope that we're going to have successful reintroduction occurring. I put this one in because it's kind of our little initiation for anyone new to the project. When you first hold the oxpeckers, they actually are pretty calm once you've got them out of the nets. But then what they really do like to do the minute you make any sort of sharp movement is that those little talons just grip on anything, and you can imagine how sharp they are because they have to hang on the sides of animals, especially when they're running off and things. So man, that was really painful. And you can see, if you look closely, how that one has really hooked Rebotila's skin there. And this was always fine. You would be able to unhook, and you put the rings on, and you put the bird into the aviary, and then you would forget, and you'd use hand sanitizer, and then you would realize how many little puncture wounds you had all over your fingers. So that was an interesting experience. So once we had all the birds captured and we had them put into the aviary, we had the quarantine time. We all know what that's like, but the birds actually had a pretty good deal. We had the floor was sort of covered with nice plant material. We also made sure to include a lot of perches so that they had places to sit. And then, of course, we would provide them with a lovely dish there for food and water. And this will be replaced regularly. So if any of you are interested in what is involved in making this delicious recipe, I've put it up here on the screen for you. So Oxpecker Delight, we would include 500 grams of finely minced lean red meat. And so that would be game or beef. But what was important was that it didn't come from the area, and we would get it from outside. So beef would obviously be from outside, but for Kruger National Park, we used game that came from outside. And then we would put in an egg yolk as well. We would put 2 tablespoons of some sort of soft bull bird food. If it was available, of course, we used half a cup of the plain Pro Nutro, and then a lot of fresh blood. So we needed about 300 mils. And so this involved me driving down to the abattoir in Nelspruit and collecting 2 huge buckets of blood, and then driving it back up the 2 hours to the Kruger Park. It was a fun time. I was always worried if the buckets were going to spill over, but none of them did. So we were really lucky. And then, of course, we added this AV stress, which is like a vitamin and electrolyte component, and it just gave a little boost to the animals. So originally they were fed 5 times a day, but we had put camera traps out, and we noticed that they weren't feeding at all the times that we were putting new food out, and some of it was just getting dry and disgusting in the bowls. And then we also noticed that they didn't eat after 5 p.m. So we cut it down to just a 6 a.m., a 12 p.m., and a 4 p.m. feeding schedule, and that worked really well. And then if you have a look inside the boma itself, the enclosure, it was covered in shade cloth, which was really nice, but the oxpeckers really like to sun themselves. So that was something I'd seen them doing a lot. They'd always sit and bask in the sun. So we made sure we had heat lamps. And you can see this is a picture from 12 minutes past 1 in the afternoon in Skakuza, which would be lovely and warm. And they're still sitting in front of a heat lamp. So we're really glad we included that. And we made that a condition for any of the reintroduction sites, that either heaters or heat lamps were included for those soft release enclosures. So one of the other things that's really nice is I didn't realize how fast oxpeckers would become tame. You can see here that there's the food source, and the water in the background is kind of a yellow color because I put some more of that AV stress powder into that as well. And you can see with the enclosure, sort of little metal cage, but it's got shade cloth everywhere for the birds to hang on. And what was really fun was I would put the food sources down in the beginning and they would scream and fly around and didn't like me at all. And by the end of like the 2 weeks that they'd been in quarantine, they would be sitting on the ball waiting for me to come and picking at stuff and jumping around. They really did become super tame, and they kind of felt like, it kind of felt a little sad having to let them go at some times. Okay, so once we'd done all of those different steps and we were ready for relocation. So one of the things we had to wait for, of course, was the sexing results, and then we needed to get the permits for the birds. So we had to give them the list of the individuals that were ringed and the different sexes that were going, and then we had to make sure that the release site was ready and had suitable housing and nest boxes and everything up on the property, and then we had to organize transport. So we had these beautiful transport boxes, and they worked really, really well, and we were able to at least split the birds up quite nicely so they weren't all cramped into one box. And so how we would do this was we either would fly the birds or we would drive them from the site to the new site. If the area was really far from the Kruger Park, then we would fly them. So on occasions like that, 4 a.m. on the morning of location day, we would sneak into the aviaries with headlamps set to the red setting, and we would grab the birds while they were sleeping from the edges of the cages, and we would put them into the boxes. It was quite a thing because we had to make sure we weren't missing any birds, because they can be sneaky and hide very loudly to make sure that we could figure out that we had all the right birds. But we were pretty successful with that. And then later that day, the pilots, and we used the Bacheliers program a ton for this. They were super supportive of this initiative. They would fly into the Skokuza airport and we get special permission to land, and then we would be able to load the birds up and then fly them to their new home. And this is just a picture of me taking some birds out where they went to Makala National Park. And we actually found later that if it was a drivable distance, it was far better to drive the birds because they're pretty stressed in the airplane. But what we did for when we were driving them is we would actually catch them in the evenings that night. So as soon as the sun went down, we would go in and catch the birds, and then we would drive through the night with the birds sleeping comfortably in the boxes behind us, making cute little chipping noises. And we would just drink lots of coffee to get from point A to point B. But they arrived a lot calmer than I think they did with the flying. But some cases, if you have a far distance to go, it's much better to just let them deal with the 2 hours or whatever it was of flying rather than the long drive. Okay. So this is just showing you that when we actually got to the release site, I would show anyone who was there how to make the mixture, and we would also give them any of the, so that not the meat, but the AV stress and any pronutro and anything we had left over, so that they would know exactly how to make it, and I would show them how the consistency it needed to be. So these are some of the Makala ranges here. And then we would just like to, these are always nice pictures to look at. So the bird sitting comfortably in the new enclosure, sitting under a heat lamp. And then one of the nicest things was when you would see them jumping down and eating food straight away. So that was always a good sign. Some of them obviously don't make it, and you can tell pretty early on which ones did not travel well, but they would jump down and like ferociously eat, then you knew like this was going to be a good group of birds. And then what would happen is they would stay in that enclosure for at least a week. We usually wanted to let them acclimatize like that. And then we would tell the landowners to wait for 3 good weather days in a row to make sure that they're giving the birds the best chance when they release. And then it would just be open the doors and let them fly out. So yeah, so we had a lot of success with this, and some of the best things were actually just getting reports of sightings from landowners where they'd seen the ring bird somewhere, but we'd also get camera trap photographs of oxpeckers on birds. And so it was really nice to feel that you'd been involved in something where it was so successful and landowners were really happy with these results. And one of the other things that I think was really good was especially when you saw the breeding happening. So, you know, when you actually saw people reporting that they'd seen birds going into nests. And another great thing was seeing non-ringed birds. So as soon as you were able to see non-ringed birds, then you know that those were the offspring of the ones that you had reintroduced. So some of the very successful project, Operation Oxpecker, and it had the nice thing, I feel like we had this science-based tool now that was more up to date, that we could really look at assessing areas of whether in the current situation they would make good reintroduction sites for Oxpeckers. And then, of course, combined with the reintroductions, it has been a very successful program. So since 1988, so including all the sandparks ones, there have been around 38 known relocations. We've had 25 different release sites, and around 1,409 red-billed oxpeckers successfully released. That's not actually all of them, because we do have some mortalities. We got better and better with this as it goes on, but you know, we would have some mortalities, just some animals just don't travel well. But it was a pretty nice project to be involved in, and that's a large number of birds to be able to successfully release. And that's not actually just our success, but also the landowners, because it's their commitment to making sure that they use the correct products and being happy to have the birds in the area and being able to use this ecosystem service well. So if we go back to our maps and we have a look at what it looked like from the SABAP 1 area, where we had just those really dark blue spots really around the Kruger National Park, and then the tiny parts in KwaZulu-Natal. The next slide I'm showing you here, so keep that in mind. And then if you look at the next spot, you can see all those orange stars are the relocation sites, and then the capture areas up there in the green. And then if you have a look at the current distribution map here, you can see how we now have these spots down here which directly relate to where those reintroduction sites were. So that's been a really positive result for us, having the birds now found in all these new areas. And then of course, so the darker the color, the higher the reporting rate, which is exciting. And then I also included in the next slide the change in reporting rate. So the darker the color here, again, the blue, darker blue shows changes in reporting rates. And what was nice to see is that there's been a lot of change in reporting rates in those areas around Bloemfontein in KZN, and then down there in the Eastern Cape. People were very supportive of this project as well. We had a lot of media coverage, and this is one of the first reintroductions of oxpeckers into Mokala National Park. This is one of the first ones I was involved in, which is really exciting. And then this was another article that we wrote about saving the rhino bird that appeared in Voltenjacht magazine in January 2013. And here's another one about the release into Mokala. So we would actually end up doing 2 releases to a site, because we were allowed to put up sort of around 50 birds would be the minimum that we would want to put into a site. The going wisdom is around about 80, but we found 50 seems to work for oxpeckers. And so we would end up having to do at least 2, in most cases, reintroductions to the same spot. So what we would try and do is try and get oxpeckers from different parts, not necessarily take both sets from Kruger to Mokala, but maybe we could get Kruger and then somewhere else in Gauteng, and then take them to or Mpumalanga, and then take them to Mokala. So we tried to mix up the genetic diversity in that way. But we would find after about 2 trips down, we were pretty successful. And then I went through and tried to find photographs of all the people that have been involved, just as a thank you to them. So I will list the people I found, but there are a lot of people that I haven't been able to mention here who I couldn't find pictures from. But Andre Botha on the top left managed the Birds of Prey program, was instrumental in training me. Rebotile Rashuene and Morena Jordan, you saw them earlier in the presentation. They were so Rebotile is part of the EWT, and Morena was doing her master's with Colleen Downs. They're from UKZN below her. And then on the right-hand side is Arno LaRue. So he handed the project over to me, and he was really fantastic in teaching me all the ins and outs about oxpeckers and how to do things. He was a great help. Then on the far left-hand side, I've put a picture of Ritika. So she was great in developing helping to develop the niche model that we can now use. And then I have Gerard Verdoren and Dr. Ian White. So they were also very instrumental in planning the projects and just guiding me and helping me in doing this work. There's some other people. I couldn't find a picture of Eugene Morea, who used to run this, and Josef Heymans was also fantastic in training me with ringing and that as well. And that's kind of all I have to say for the moment. It was really fun going back through all my old information and pulling out all these pictures. And we couldn't have done this without any sponsors. And I must say, there were a lot of people who supported this, the Sandbox and the EWT, and then the universities. We got a very big grant from the Green Fund, which covered my salary and all of the reintroductions from 2013 to 2015, 16. So that was pretty nice. And we, of course, had great support from the Ford Wildlife Foundation, AfriVet, Rand Merchant Bank, and of course, I can't say enough about the Bateliers, who were really instrumental in this. But I must say, I'm very proud to have been part of a project where we were able to take a species from being listed as near threatened to being downlisted to least concern during the time that I was running the project. So I feel at least I've done a little bit for conservation in that way. So I hope you found this interesting. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leigh. That was really, really interesting. And you can see all the little emojis coming up that the audience also found it really interesting. So thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge with us. And it was really great to hear your personal side of the reintroduction process as well, and all the little intricacies and anecdotes. And I just also wanted to mention that Rebotile is actually in the audience tonight. So
awesome. That's great.
Yeah, so thank you so much. There's quite a lot of questions coming in, so thanks everyone for putting them in. We'll try and get through as many as we can before 8 o'clock. So let's just kick off with the first questions. So firstly from Warren, and I'll also group that with Peter's question. So Warren asks, are there any records of oxpeckers taking ticks from vegetation? And then Peter's question was, most of the species, host species were ungulates. Are there any records of oxpeckers taking ticks from canines or felines? So maybe just a bit more about their diet and how they go about foraging.
So in terms of from vegetation, not that I know of, and also not that I know of from felines or canines. I think the reason is because of the sensitivity of the skin. So I can't imagine that they would handle those claws. If you've ever held one, you'll understand. Like, they're not going to tolerate that, I don't feel. Whereas I feel like the skin of the cattle, and that's a lot tougher. And so I've never heard of anything like that, of them taking it from canines and that, no.
Okay, thanks. And then there's a question from HV. Do red-billed oxpeckers have birds that compete with them? So that any species that would be seen as competitors?
So I suppose the biggest competitor would be yellow-billed oxpeckers, because they do share some of the same hosts, except that the way that the bills are structured, and that the yellow-bills are sort of more, they've almost done what you would consider a niche partitioning, in that oxpeckers are often found on a lot of the smaller game, things like warthog and smaller things, a lot more on impala, whereas you'll more often see the yellow-billed oxpeckers on the bigger things, like on the rhinos, and that's because they like slightly different tick species. So it seems that that's probably the only one that would really be an issue for them, but otherwise, no. I think their biggest problem is if the ticks are being removed from pesticides, and then there's not enough to sustain them.
Yeah. So linked to the yellow-billed oxpeckers, Mark Anderson says, great talk, Leigh. It's been interesting to see how yellow-billed oxpeckers have expanded their range in the Lowveld, and in some areas they now seem to be more common than red-billed oxpeckers. Do you have any comments about why that might be?
No, I didn't actually know that was occurring. So that's actually really interesting and nice. When we were in sand parks, we were trying to get a project off the ground, and I think Guy Hauser was looking at studying them to actually look at what was happening with yellow-billed oxpeckers in the park, and we were monitoring sightings that were being recorded in that. But no, I'm not quite sure why. No, sorry.
Okay, there's quite a lot of questions, so I'm just skimming through them. So there's one from Leslie saying, if they nest in metal fence poles, as you showed in one of your photos, can these not get too hot when it's sunny?
I would think that they could get very hot. I mean, I have done nesting, putting eye buttons in nest boxes of other species that are adapted to living in areas like the Kruger National Park. I did this for the ground hornbills, and some of them were nesting in plastic drums where the temperatures were getting over 50 degrees Celsius in the day, and they were still nesting successfully. Potentially, yes, they could have. And maybe that's why we didn't find them in those poles that day. But, you know, I think that they probably would try any cavity that looks like it could be suitable. And then if it ends up not being suitable for being too hot, they would have to move on and find something else. When we insisted that people put nest boxes out, they were all wooden, similar to the design that you can see there behind Christina. And we tried to get them up and at certain heights and close to water sources where we knew animals would come to drink. So we were quite strategic in where we placed them. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. Then there's a couple of questions relating to the capture process and the quarantine. So Marinda and Penny asked, what is the purpose of that quarantine period? What would you be looking for?
So they're quarantined mainly because they've been feeding on animals in the Kruger National Park that have where anthrax is, and where they could have other types of diseases. So we would make sure that we had them in this aviary, but we fed them on blood from cattle from like the abattoir in Nelspruit, so that we were giving them like a clean diet. And the other reason that we had the quarantine was to make sure that we could get the reintroduction site and all the permits in place. So it was a couple of reasons, and then so it took a bit of time. It would usually be between a week and 2 weeks that they would be in quarantine, so they become pretty tame in that time. And then we also had to get the sexing results back. So that was something really important because we didn't know. We would know we had a group, but we didn't know whether we had, of the 6, 5 of them were males and 1 female, and we wanted to make sure when we were putting groups in that we had a good mix of sexes to make sure that we were putting in like groups that would be successful. So there were a couple of reasons for it. A lot of it is just paperwork, and permits take time. And once you have got the blood results back, that would often take about a week just to get those back to confirm the sexes of the birds and things. So yeah, everything moved slowly, but it was good for the birds. We had them, you know, they would calm down quite nicely and get very used to us. And I think that all helped with the reintroduction. And it also helped with having them in the soft release areas there. So they were already used to being in that kind of enclosure and being fed on a metal tray. What they actually used to do prior to when we did it was they would bring a donkey in and they would tie the food tray to the donkey so as to tell the oxpecker that the food was there. But then I think they fed more off the donkey, tried to look for things on the donkey than they did actually the food itself. But yeah, there've been some interesting stories.
Yeah, wow, lots of interesting stories. I guess especially as you go through that trial and error, I guess, learning what works and what doesn't. So you have actually answered 2 other questions I was going to ask. One was the blood and the meat from the Oxpecker delight needing to be outside the area, which has to do with feeding them a clean diet. And then Peter asked how you sex them, and I believe that's through blood samples.
Yes, and then different primers that will show up and give you like 2 bars for a female and 1 bar for a male. It's just with blood and DNA basically. So yeah, it's easy to see, but it just takes time because we would have to send the samples to Joburg, and they would then get put on like a conveyor belt, and we didn't know when they were actually going to get done. So it took a bit of time to get that done.
Great, yeah, thanks. Okay, I'm just looking for the next question. Celeste asks, is the population stable now in areas that could support them, or do you think additional reintroduction projects be useful?
That's a very good question. It's something I've been thinking about for a while, and actually when I went in to check that and get the data for the IUCN Global Red List, if you look at it, it says it's least concern based on where it is, but it lists the population as declining. And then every time I went in to delve a bit deeper into why is it declining in different sites, all it said was that there's not enough information known on the current population numbers. And that seems to be kind of throughout, especially I've looked at the most recent research because I pulled up a lot of papers to see what's been happening since I've been involved in the red-billed oxpecker world. And there's a lot of research being done, but it's a lot of host specificity and which which are the most, and feeding preferences, that kind of stuff. And I can't fault that. I did those projects myself, and they're nice and they're fun and easy to do. But I do think it would be worth doing a proper population assessment and actually seeing what is going on, because they're not out of the woods just because they're least concern. There are still organophosphate compounds that can cause loss of the birds, and we don't know we don't know what's going on in different areas. We should keep a handle on this and not just assume because it's least concern that it's protected. I will say it was very difficult to get funding for this project because the species was near threatened, so it wasn't endangered enough. And then when it became least concern, everyone was like, well done, job done. And so it's great, but it's also a bit of a double-edged sword in that way, because people don't necessarily worry so much. You don't get the funding for the species that are considered comfortable in a way. So yeah, I'm not sure if they're considered declining in South Africa at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, but you want to get them before they get to critically endangered, as the species that I work on is currently now, because then it's starting to get too late. So working on them while they're near threatened is actually the best thing to do.
That was perfect, and I think that was half the reason it was successful, is they were not too far where the reintroductions were able to really assist the population.
Exactly, yeah. And then there's a question from Rob Simmons, and this is something I also wanted to know the answer to, so it's a bit of a selfish choosing this one. But are there places where you introduced the oxpeckers that farmers stopped using pesticide dips altogether? So how kind of effective are they in natural control?
So some of the places, a lot of the places we actually introduced them, the farmers were wildlife farmers, and so they weren't having any dips used at all. Mostly it was in the wildlife farmers that wanted this. The cattle farmers, it would go almost the other way, where I showed you where we ended up catching all the oxpeckers on those properties. So they had too many, and they would almost tell me, like, if I don't come, they're going to sort the problem out themselves. And so we would be like, we better go and catch these oxpeckers. But so I do think that it can get to the point that you can almost become overrun with oxpeckers. It can be pretty successful. I don't think that farmer that had all the oxpeckers had any issues with ticks. He was more concerned that he had too many oxpeckers. But with our follow-ups that we did, we mainly wanted to check that the birds were breeding, and a lot of the times with the ones that I did specifically, there hadn't really been enough time between when I'd released the birds to when I went back to check with the farmers for me to be able to accurately assess how effective they'd been in reducing tick numbers.
Okay, interesting. Then there's a question from Nigel saying he's puzzled why the species didn't recolonize areas naturally. They must range quite widely in search of animals to feed on, so you'd think they would disperse quite well through open savanna and not need so much help. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it was mainly the dipping. The dipping seemed to be the biggest issue. And so then, because I think wherever you had sort of the wildlife areas that would sort of be alongside Kruger, you also have a lot of people that farm with cattle there. And so there's that mix between the cattle and the wildlife. And so where they're dipping the cattle, if the oxpeckers are fine on the wildlife, but then they go and eat ticks from the cattle dipped in the wrong compounds, they're not going to survive. So that really seemed to be a turning point for being able to reintroduce them. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think it was a lack of tick species.
Right. Stanley and Zana, sorry, ask about if you know kind of what the status of the reintroduction at Makala is now. Was it successful? And then Stanley says they saw 12 birds on a farm over the river at Koppieskraal. So do you have any insight into Makala and what the situation is there?
So Makala, we did 2 reintroductions, and from what I know, it's been very successful. We got lots of reports of birds with rings that they were seeing a lot, often coming back to the aviary that they built, which was interesting. So we've had a lot of reports of unringed birds as well. It's been a while since, if I'm honest, it's been a while since I checked in on that one, but to the best of my knowledge, it has been successful, yes.
That's great. And then more of a comment, but kind of linked to success or otherwise of reintroductions. Mark Anderson says there have been several reintroductions in the Kimberley area, one small one by a few of us into the De Beers Rooiport Nature Reserve, and a small population established on Rooiport and the surrounding properties, which is surprising that they've established a small population in the greater Kimberley area, but in spite of the absence of their 2 favorite tick species, the limited number of nest cavities and the very cold winters. So that's quite interesting that they've established up there.
It is. I do remember the Rooiport. That was one of the sites that we that was on the list of reintroduction sites. I mean, they can be in grasslands, I suppose. If they don't, they must be finding nest cavities somewhere. Yeah, and it's their favorite tick species, but that was also a project that was done a long time ago, so I'm not sure whether they've adapted to new species now. Yes, and the comments about the cold winters, we had to make sure that there were not more than 2 or 3 days of frost in the year. So that was kind of the cutoff. If they had more days than that of frost on the ground in the year, then it was considered to be too cold for them. That's something I never checked, but it was something that I just used as a baseline that was told to me. I wasn't going to go and test that necessarily by putting 12, 25 birds in and having them all die because I didn't listen to what previous people had suggested. So it may be that they can now tolerate lower temperatures, but it wasn't something I was going to trial during my time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have gone past 8 o'clock, but there's still quite a few questions. Are you still okay to answer a few more?
Yes.
Because we still have quite a few of our viewers joining us, so it would be great if we can answer a couple more.
Okay.
Thanks. So David Allen says, great talk. Why don't red-billed oxpeckers occur in West Africa, given that yellow-billed oxpecker is widespread there and overlaps widely with the red-billed in southern, central, and East Africa? Do you have any insights?
No, I'm not sure. I've only ever seen that they like those specific habitats, and it's really kind of up the east of Africa. I've never really considered that, so that's an interesting observation. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I wonder if it has to do with host species and the ticks that occur on them, but someone should look into that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, even historically, I don't think they occurred there. So it would be interesting to look back and see what. Okay.
Yeah, interesting. Michael Potts asks, have you found that the overpopulation of elephants in Greater Kruger and the resulting destruction of many of the tall and medium-sized trees is negatively affecting the breeding of oxpeckers?
I didn't actually study the breeding of oxpeckers in Kruger. I would say It could work in their favor, especially if they're breaking off a branch and creating a hollow. They don't need a very big cavity. I feel a little differently about this if we were talking about ground hornbills, which is what I did my PhD on. They're being so big, they need really big cavities for nest sites. But for oxpeckers, they don't need a very big cavity. So it might work in their favor if they're just breaking a branch and, and it's not too low to the ground where the hole is that they are creating. So, but it's probably something that should be looked into. And, I do think that they're a wonderful bird to study, and it would be really nice if some more projects that looked at things like that could actually say that, they're considered safe in Kruger. A lot of things are considered safe in Kruger, and that may not actually be the case. And so we should actually investigate that further.
Absolutely. And maybe the Oxpeckers being chosen as the bird of the year might kickstart some interest.
Inspire
Hopefully.
somebody.
Yeah. Warren asks, is there any species that fulfill the Oxpecker ecosystem services in Europe and the Americas, given that Oxpeckers are confined to Africa?
So the only one that comes to mind for me is the cowbird here in the States. That one has been sort of touted as the kind of American version of the Oxpecker here. But other than that, no, I don't really know of anything else that does this unique ecosystem service.
Interesting. Sorry, I lost the question I was going to ask. Oh yes, from another question from Peter Archdale. Did the ringing give any indication of the lifespan of the Oxpeckers?
I don't know. We didn't have color rings on the original stuff from the 1980s, but I haven't seen, we didn't get a lot of recaptures either when we would do things, and so I'm not entirely sure about their lifespan. I wouldn't think very long. That would be similar to what you would expect for a starling, I suppose, but no, I haven't, but I haven't actually investigated these numbers. Like, that's a very good question. We should be writing all of these down and offering them to students as projects, but I haven't looked into that, so I can't really speak to that.
Okay. Then Alison asks, once you've released birds onto a farm, do they remain there or do they move further away onto neighboring farms? Like, what is the range they normally cover?
So a lot of the landowners would report seeing them hanging around the site, the actual site that they released, and often we would put if they could, we would try and put the structure or choose the structure on the farm where we knew that animals were nearby. So if there was a little abandoned storeroom, something that was near a water site that we knew the animals came to, we would make that the soft release site, just make sure that we could get heating and everything to that spot. So people have said that they've seen the birds move out from there, but generally they seem to they start closest to where they are and then they branch from there. But Fountain Hill Estate has had that's in KwaZulu-Natal, they've had some really good numbers reported from our reintroduction there, and onto neighboring farms where they would tell me that neighbors next door had seen ringbirds on their farm that was located next door. So that's another reason why whenever we would want to do a reintroduction, we couldn't just stick to the champion landowner. We had to make sure that all the people in the surrounding area were okay with it. Because if you just take one landowner who doesn't stick to the program, and you could lose all the birds that you put in, or at least a great deal of the ones. And it's, as you can see, it was a lot of like funding and time and effort, and a whole lot of people had to come together to make this happen each time, and we would do at least 2 a year. So it was a lot to put in to have birds not make it. So we really tried to do everything we possibly could to make this successful.
Absolutely. And or if it's anything like my project that I'm working on to reestablish the penguin colony at De Hoop, most of the work happens before you actually are doing anything with the birds. It's all the getting the permits and the processes and dealing with the landowners and all of that kind of thing that happens before you even, catch a bird.
Correct.
There's a question from Lizelle, just going back to the keeping the birds in quarantine and asking why you include Pro Nutro in your Oxpecker Delight recipe.
So I adapted a recipe that was provided to me, but we just put it in because it has like vitamins and things in, so we just wanted to add it as a little bit of bulk as well, and just to sort of boost them for that. But yeah, it
Okay.
worked.
Yeah,
The mixture worked.
obviously it did,
We
yeah.
also, the bane of my existence, we would sometimes get beef liver, and most of the times when we were doing these, well, a lot of it, I was pregnant, and we would grate the liver. That was the most disgusting smell I've ever had to deal with, being nauseous and pregnant. Ugh. But anyway,
Oh no.
birds come first, so we did it. But we would try not to give liver too often, but just as a supplement every now and again, we would add some liver in. It's gross.
Hmm. Yeah, the things we do for
I
the
know.
birds. So there's a question, or yeah, comment question from Arno Elmo. During Operation Oxpecker, we ringed many red-billed oxpeckers in northern Limpopo. While handling and processing the birds, we noticed some birds changed eye color from the normal red color to yellow or partially yellow. Some birds even had one eye red and one eye yellow simultaneously. And the change appears to be related to blood draining from the eye. Some researchers have mentioned this phenomenon is stress related. Do you have any insights to share on that?
Yeah, it was something I noticed a lot, actually. I noticed that their eyes would go almost like super red when we had them in hand. And then they would go less red when they were in the bomas and calm and used to me. It was something I would always know. And so I would be very cognizant of that when we were handling them to try and minimize the amount of time that we did for that. Interesting that I noticed it the other way around. If she's thinking of the blood draining, it's linking to the stress. Yeah, they definitely do respond to stress, and the eye color is definitely one way to tell that. But I noticed it in the opposite way. It was like much more prominent red when they seem to be super stressed. If I remember
Interesting.
correctly.
Okay. Yeah, maybe that's lots of blood rushing to the eye.
Yeah.
So many questions.
Yeah. Would be, especially with, it was funny because the birds would react, especially if you caught a juvenile first. If you caught a juvenile first, you were guaranteed to catch the whole group because they would just
Oh,
scream
wow.
and scream and scream and scream, and all the birds would freak out and then fly around. They almost forget that they're supposed to look for obstacles, and then they would just all land in the net. So it worked really well for us, but it was mildly stressful for them. But
I'm
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
I think we will just, there's still a few more questions in here, but I think we'll just answer two more if that's okay. And then perhaps if you have the time, I can send you the questions and you could reply to the people if you have the time.
Okay.
Firstly, from Sue Whitelaw, asking whether you know if the use of ivermectin in cattle has had any impact on the oxpeckers.
Not that I know of. I don't think that would have too much of an effect on the tick species because that's much more for sort of internal worms and things. So I think it would probably, I don't know if it would have an effect on blood supply and then what the ticks are eating, but not that I know of. I haven't seen any reports linking ivermectin and ticks and oxpeckers.
Okay, interesting. Sorry, I'm going to change that to three more questions. So these will be the last two. Sorry.
Okay.
So Josh says that he finds it fascinating how this bird's conservation relies on both anthropogenic and natural areas for survival. To what extent are the populations of both oxpecker species dependent on livestock as opposed to wild ungulates? And does this have any implications for future conservation of the birds?
I think it's pretty much they will sit on something that is available that will have ticks on them. They will quite happily go from a wild animal onto cattle, and we've seen that on farms that have sort of mixed animals on there. So I think if you're putting them into an area where there's only cattle, they'll happily feed on cattle. I don't think they necessarily discriminate against it like that. And I do think that they could be in areas as long as they're suitable and they have the correct nesting sites, and then as long as the tick species are available for them, or at least there's sufficient tick species. If they have switch to different preferences of ticks now, as long as there's sufficient food to keep them going and nest sites that, you know, and making sure that people aren't using the incorrect, not the incorrect, but the ones that are not considered Oxpecker friendly, the acaricides that aren't considered Oxpecker friendly. I think they could definitely continue to survive in those areas that they've been reintroduced in.
Yeah, and just linked to that, there's a more of a comment from Lynette Rudman saying they're thriving here in the Eastern Cape after being reintroduced in the mid-1990s. So that's great to hear. And then the last question is from Faisal, asking, do you know of any unintended consequences of the reintroductions, or is it kind of too early to tell? Has there been anything that's surprised you or?
No, not really. We have had some cases where when we put birds in, there was a cold snap and then some of the birds died. And so, but a lot of them didn't, like a lot of them still survived. So there've been like learning curves along the way. But of course, weather happens and you can't necessarily always control for these things. And
Exactly.
when everything's in place and you're going and then you get there and everyone's like, oh, it's not a good time, you're like, well, it's not much you can do about that. So yeah, so sometimes it involves making sure that the landowners are all on board and happy to participate, and that they will dedicate that time when the birds are there to make sure that they have the most successful reintroduction. I generally didn't have an issue with a lot of these landowners because they really wanted the birds to succeed and survive, and they wanted that ecosystem service. It was really nice to see how many people were so keen to not have to rely on dips and things to control diseases. So that was really great, and it was a fantastic project to have been a part of. Really, I was very lucky.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a great success story. So yeah, thanks very much to you for all your work, and of course all the many people who are also involved. So yeah, I think we will leave it there for this evening, and it just remains for me to say thank you so much again for taking the time to prepare the presentation. It was really, really, really great to kick off our season 6 of Conservation Conversations with such a brilliant presentation, especially about our bird of the year. And on that note, just to let everyone know to keep an eye out for the various Bird of the Year initiatives that'll be coming out throughout the year, from fact sheets and posters and all those sorts of things and educational materials. So do keep an eye out for more Bird of the Year throughout the year. So with that, thank you very much again, Leigh, and thank you to all our viewers for sticking with us and asking all your great questions. And we will see you again on the 4th of February for another Conservation Conversations. Thanks very much, everyone, and good night. Or good morning to Leigh. Bye, everyone.
Bye.